Thank you so much for coming to our presentation today. This is Joseph Clappard. He is an urban biology, I promise I can say that right, urban biologist from Texas Parks and Wildlife, and he's going to do a presentation on waterfowl for y'all today, okay? Thank you.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? I'm a bit of a wanderer, and thankfully my voice kind of projects pretty good, so hopefully everybody can hear me throughout. But if at any point you can't, just raise your hand and let me know. I'll repeat and be a little louder. But yeah, thank you all for coming out, and thank you, Felicia, for rescheduling last minute. I'm very sorry for the fall through on my part on the scheduling side last time, but I'm glad I got the opportunity to come and give this talk again, because birds are some of my favorite things that I'm going to talk about, and ducks are a neat type of bird. So I'm mostly going to be talking about waterfowl, what we have, how we deal with them, things we should do to promote them, things we shouldn't do that hurt them, and hopefully you guys will learn a little bit something. I am, like Felicia said, I'm an urban biologist for Texas Parks and Wildlife. I've been in that position for a long tenured 1 year almost. we're about a month away from a year. I've been with the department for about. Slob is going to be the death of me. So that I don't snag on the cable. All right. Can you hear me fine? There we go. And I'm not going to get snagged on the cable. I'm not used to wearing a wire. That's not what I'm used to. And contrary to what some people think about the state government, I don't wear wire. But yeah, I've been here for a little less than a year. Started back in August of last year, and I've been with the department for a little less than 2 years. I was a private lands biologist down in Laredo. When I started out, I was there for about a year and a half until I overheated, and then I came back. Today I'm going to talk to you about the negative impacts of feeding waterfowl and some of the waterfowl you have here. Seems to be cutting in and out, but we'll make the best of it. I'm a loud talker, so hopefully you guys can hear me, even if the mic keeps cutting out. Are you working? Oh, of course, none of my technology is working today. Alright. I'm gonna pop this up. Grab you. Test. There we go. This seems like this might be a little bit more conducive to what we're actually trying to do. So, these are some of our native duck species that we have up here. This is not an exhaustive list of everything that you have, but I went ahead and just went to iNaturalist, looked for sightings of a nearby lake, and pulled these from there. So we have mallards, we have Canada goose, we have northern shovelers. You can tell shovelers because they have the shovel-looking face. You have gadwall, you have American widgeon. Wood ducks are the really, really pretty ones, probably the one that everybody knows from Atlanta Park and other places. We have blue-winged teal, ringneck ducks, lesser scaup, buffalo head, ruddy ducks, green-winged teals, and black-bellied whistling ducks, northern pintail, hooded merganser, and many, many, many more. This is not an exhaustive list at all, but these are some of your native duck species. And if you're saying, I haven't seen a whole ton of those at my ponds, it's probably because most of what you're seeing is non-native, especially this time of year, or invasive. Of all the ones that I just showed, those three right there, the wood duck, the blue-winged teal, and the black-bellied whistling duck, are some of the few that we really have here consistently this time of year. For the most part, all the rest of these guys are going to be here in the winter. But we don't only have waterfowl, we don't only have ducks, we have a bunch of other things that like to hang out. So we have little blue herons, American coots, eastern phoebes, one of my personal favorites, yellow-crowned night herons, great egrets, and I did not put all the egrets up there. There's great egrets and snow egrets and cattle egrets, you see those in large numbers in San Antonio. Killdeer, grebes. Grebes are another one of my favorites. They're super cute little guys. Favorite thing about them, if you ever look up like a field guide of a grebe, you're always going to see a photo with the babies riding on the back, because that's the strategy. The babies are really, really bad at swimming when they're really, really tiny, so they all climb aboard the mom boat and they ride her around. It's really, really, really cute. And so even though that bird is only yay big, all its little babies climb on top and ride it around. It's very cute. Green herons, red-winged blackbirds, we have those in a large abundance. Red-shouldered hawk, that is not exclusive to being around water, but they do tend to associate with waterways. And so we do see a lot of red-shouldered hawks around waterways. Cormorants, those are the ones that not too many people are generally excited to see because they eat all the nice fish. Yellow-billed cuckoos, that's the one you'll hear and never see because they're very cryptic. I've seen probably a good number in my life, but really the first time I ever saw a yellow-billed cuckoo is still the best sighting I've ever had of a yellow-billed cuckoo. And then tricolored heron, great blue heron. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but this is just a smattering of different cool things that you can see in and around your waterways. And one of the things we talked about, we haven't put anything on the schedule yet, and so I'll hash this out with Felicia, but I want to come back at a later date when it's cooled down a little bit earlier in the morning, and we'll go and do a little bird walk and look at some of the stuff you have at your ponds, and I can help you identify things and talk about the things in situ, in the field, rather than just sitting in the AC and listen to me yammer on a PowerPoint. But probably what you're more used to seeing are these guys. If you go to any city park, you go to any public park, if you go to Landa Park in New Braunfels, these are what you're going to see right by my house. I live on the northwest side. There's a pond I drive by every day off Culebra. It's a little neighborhood HOA park, and I swung in there the other day just to check it out, and every single duck species I counted was invasive. This one in the kind of top left up here with a nice little hairdo, and then the one right below it are both kind of domestic types. The one on the bottom kind of looks like a mallard, but wrong. And that's because it's got a bunch of domestic duck mixed in there. So these domestic duck species are released by people. People grow them for agricultural reasons, for their eggs or for their meat, and then get tired of doing that or decide to release it, or they get one as a pet because they think it's cute on Easter, and then they don't realize that they get bigger and they poop everywhere and it's not very fun to have as a pet. And so then they end up releasing them in your nice neighborhood pond, and then you get a whole bunch of these weird hybrid mutant looking ducks that are kind of parts of everything but not really anything themselves. And so those are all just domestic mixes when they have those weird coloration patterns and those real prominent curly Q drake feathers on the end. You see those a lot more in male domestics. You don't see that as much in the wild types. A few tenacious ones. Well, here, I won't call Muscovy too tenacious yet. Muscovy, there are native Muscovy ducks in Texas, but they would only be native to like the southern portions of the state. And so there are areas where they are native. Most of the Muscovies you see are not native. They're exotics or domestics that were released. And then the two kind of tenacious ones I'll talk about are the Egyptian goose up top. That's one that if you've ever been to a golf course or anything like that, you've seen this goose. It threw me off when I was first learning what birds were. I was checking my field guide and flipping through pages and pages and pages. I'm like, what in the world is this bird? Turns out it's not in the field guide because it's not supposed to be on this continent. It's an Egyptian goose. It's from Eurasia, right? It is not meant to be over here. But we see them in large quantities, right? I was at Woodlawn Lake Park last week and saw, 40, 50, something like that. They're prolific breeders. The hard thing with birds as an invasive species is they're hard to contain because they can fly, right? And they even have some instincts that drive them to fly. And so, yeah, it may only be, it's only a few birds at our park, but if they establish a population and then they eventually get too, tight to hold everybody, and then a few will split off and then go ruin another park and another park and another park and another park, and they spread all across North America. These were mostly brought in because they're pretty. That's why Egyptian geese were brought in, because they're nice to look at. People like them at golf courses. People like to stare at them. They're one of the harder invasives to remove. just because when you go to suggest removing invasives, people tend to get upset when you remove the pretty things. And then another one is the mute swan. So those are ones that I know are on site. I've seen photos of them, and I'm going to talk about them a little bit more because I was requested, because they're kind of a topic of interest here. But they are not actually native to this continent. So here's mute swans. So mute swans are native to Europe, native to Eurasia. The photo over there and the photo over there are the ones that Felicia sent me. So those are actually your mute swans. And so they're really pretty charismatic birds, and that's pretty much why they're here in North America. So these are the ones that, if you've ever heard the story that for all of my life until a couple years ago, it was the Queen of England, now the King of England, owns all the swans in UK. If you've heard that story, that fun fact, these are the ones they're mostly talking about, these mute swans. They also own all the other swans, but the mute swans are the prized possessions. They were a symbol of aristocracy, a symbol of wealth and prominence. They were also a very beloved food source. And so they were, their range in Europe is very complicated, and it's hard to tease out what is true historic range and what is modified historic range, because they've been in coexistence along people for so long, and people have been there so long. It's a long history of, we want to eat swans, so we release them in an area, they get extirpated because everybody wants to eat them, and then they introduce them again, and then they pop up, and that's a large part of their range. Nowadays, that's not so much the case over in Europe. They aren't protected under Migratory Bird Treaty Act over here, because that's a North American thing, but they do have their own treaty acts, and they have their own bird conservation over there. They are protected in most of Europe. There is some allowed hunting in Germany and Austria, where their numbers are very high and can actually support hunting that. So whenever we see populations of anything that is doing very well and could be a potential food source, then hunting is a good way to kind of keep those populations at a good healthy level, to keep them from harming the environment by being overabundant, like we kind of see with our urban deer, right? Yeah, so that's a good little kind of picture of them. The one up top is what the juveniles look like. So their first year of life, or first couple years of their life, they look this kind of drab gray color, and then they get the beautiful white coloration when they get a little bit older. But I will say, so here's like that range. So that's the range map. It's a little hard to see, but this area, for the most part, that's the native range. Now, some of that stuff on the far eastern side might not be. I'm not incredibly familiar with the distribution of this species, because it is not on the continent that I did all my studying on, right? So I'm not charged with the management of mute swans, so I don't know a ton about their ecologies. Is basically what I was looking up for this talk. But these two ranges are kind of their non-native ranges. So Japan is not considered natural or native. They're considered invasive over there. And then up in the northeast of the United States, they're pretty prolifically invasive up there. I don't think we have a ton of problems with them down here. I think they're just part of the mix of kind of invasive stuff that we have lying around. But up in the northeast, they do actually pretty severely impact some habitat. And this is a good point and time to stop and do a little aside on state governance and what we do and what we don't do. We manage the wildlife for the people, right? That is kind of our charge. That's the North American model of wildlife management. All of you own the wildlife, and we, as the state governance, manage it through hunting regulations and regulations on non-game species. It's different from a lot of the European models where, the royalty owns it, or because again, still to this day, I guess, what is it, King Charles now? He owns all the swans. You can't do anything with swans in the UK because he owns them, right? What we do when we come to private lands, so on our public lands, on our state parks, on our wildlife management areas, those kinds of things, we do actively manage that wildlife. We will go in and remove invasive species. We will always advocate for the removal of invasive species. But on private lands, we're not going to tell you what to do on your property, right? So if the Army residents wants our input on what they should do for wildlife management, the pure biological, non-ethical, just pure biological thing to do would be to remove all of those mute swans. But I can see the grumbles, I can see the faces turn. This is when I lose the crowd and get chased out the door with pitchforks, right? It is just a recommendation. If they are not causing significant harm, we can take a look at that particular population. If they're not causing significant disruption to your pond systems, and they're causing a significant amount of enjoyment for the residents, then it may not be the most appropriate thing for them to do to remove them. So that is a decision for the residents to make, a decision for the management to make, not a decision for me to make. I don't come in and say, you got mute swans, you got to get rid of them. I'm the government, I say so. That's not how this ever works. We don't come in and tell you what to do with stuff on your private property. The only few exceptions to that are like game animals, which we do manage. We do tell you, you can't just shoot anything you want because it's on your property if it's a game animal. We do manage those. But if it's a non-game animal or an invasive species, it doesn't have any of the protections that the Migratory Bird Treaty Act offers. But I'm not going to tell you you have to remove those mute swans. So, this is stuff, again, recommendations, but these are the things I would much more strongly encourage you to do. So, we handle things with more education and outreach than we do, waving the stick around. Do not feed any of these things to ducks and geese. If you're doing it already, please stop. Oh.
We were trying to build up the emphasis of what not to feed them,
Congratulations, guys. You have the record for the most technical difficulties I've ever had in the talk. This is the most difficult I've ever had. And eventually, I'm just going to start waxing poetic without any tech features. So, do not feed any of these things to ducks and geese. They should not eat chips. They should not eat popcorn. They should not eat crackers. And they certainly should not eat bread. These are not natural things for these things to forage on. They have been evolving for many and many, many millennia to eat certain things. None of those are these things on this list, right? Anything that's human food should not be fed to a duck, should not be fed to a goose. What are some of their natural foods? Aquatic plants. For your mute swans, that's a huge one. Snails, worms, mollusks, small crustaceans like crawdads, grass, algae, small fish in the case of grebes, even kind of larger, medium-sized fish if you're talking about cormorants, right? But for ducks specifically, these are kind of the things that they eat in the group of waterfowl and group of ducks. I'm willing to bet that anybody that's ever gone out to feed the ducks at any point in their life has never pulled out a pocket of worms or a pocket of mollusks or a pocket of small crustaceans, right? You probably pulled out some bread, you probably pulled out some grain or something like that. That is not what they should be eating. Human food is not healthy for wildlife. That goes for any wildlife. Usually what I'm talking about when I talk about these things, I'm usually giving an urban deer talk about don't feed them deer corn over and over and over again. And I will beat that drum until I run out of a voice because it's very important. So there's many, many reasons why you shouldn't do this, and I will talk about them in subsequent slides. But the one that has the biggest impact on me, and the one that I think is most important, is most people that are feeding these animals is not because they have any malice towards them and they want to hurt them with bread. It's because they want to interact with wildlife, they want to enjoy them, or they feel bad that they're not getting enough food and they want to feed them. They're usually doing it out of compassion and out of love, not out of any malice. But when you feed bread to a duck, especially bread's the worst one. If you're going to feed anything, don't make it bread. It expands in their stomachs and it fills them up. And so I'll liken it to if you offer it up to your kids or your grandkids, hey, do you guys want ice cream for dinner? Right? They're probably going to say yes to that, right? There's not too many kids that turn that option down if you offer them up ice cream for dinner. And they're going to eat a lot of it. And they're going to feel full, probably overstuffed and too full and have a little bit of a sugar coma, right? But if you were doing that every single night, would you feel like you were giving the proper nutrition to your grandkid or your kid, right? No, they feel full every single night, but at a certain point, they're going to start having some malnutrition. They're going to start having some issues because all they're getting is fat and sugar, and they're not getting any of the other essential nutrients that they need. They're not getting protein and stuff like that. The same thing happens when you feed bread or deer corn to deer. It fills up their stomach. It depresses that hunger, right? When you feel hungry, you go get a snack. The same for the wildlife. When they feel that hunger impulse, they go and they find food. Well, if they are all constantly feeling full, they're not going to seek out enough native food sources, wild food sources, natural food sources, to actually get the proper nutrition that they need. And then you kind of lead to, and this is pretty sad, a animal that can actually starve to death and die of malnutrition while feeling like it's full. And in my opinion, that's kind of a cruel way to go, right? And so if you don't do it for any of the other reasons I'm about to talk about that are more esoteric and more, for the good of the environment and good for the populations and the habitat and all that kind of stuff, do it out of your compassion for the ducks. Increased disease spreads, that's one, right? You're concentrating things in unnaturally high densities, and they are interacting in higher densities than they would in the wild, which means more nose-to-nose contact. And as we saw with a recent pandemic that we all went through, the higher the concentration of organisms, the more that they're coming into contact, especially if they're rubbing noses or touching faces, the higher chance there is for disease spread. So things like avian influenza or trichomoniasis, right? These things spread when they are either touching nose to nose, beak to beak, or when they are drinking out of the same water sources or eating off the same feeders, or if you have the same pile of bread on the ground and they're all fighting over a piece of it, right? It's increasing their densities, which leads to increased disease transmission. And it also is increasing their odds of touching noses with one another. Habituation, this is another big one. This is actually a reason why a lot of people choose to feed. Because you get this cool little Disney magical moment where you get to feed an animal right out of your hand, right? And it's cool. As somebody that's dedicated my entire life to studying wildlife, I understand that that's really cool. I get where that comes from. But the problem with habituation for wildlife is they lose their fear of people. Everybody has seen a crazy video on the internet of a goose attacking somebody, right? Generally speaking, the very wild geese that do not interact with people don't act that way. They act with fear when they're around people. They may do some posturing, but they're not going to chase you all around the park. The ones that do that are the ones that have been fed, so they're chasing you trying to get food, and they're angry that you're not getting them food. Or they've lost their fear of people, and so they no longer see you as a threat, and they are just trying to run you off because they feel like they can push their weight around, right? And that goes for any wildlife, right? Ducks and geese can be a little bit of a nuisance, a little bit scary, but it gets a little bit more real when you start talking about like feeding coyotes and feeding deer and stuff that can actually hurt you. You get things when they lose their fear, like, oh, they're gonna lay their eggs in your flower bed, right? Because they see that as a safe place. Plenty of people this time of year, I'm getting calls because does are dropping fawns in their yards because they feel like those are safe places to be. They're hanging out in your pool, right? You don't want that. My boss's parents have a pool and it's full of black-belly whistling geese right now. Ducks. I don't know why I say geese. Non-target species, right? So let's say you go out there and you throw a whole bunch of bread and the ducks don't get it all. Well, what's going to happen at night? Well, the rats and the mice are going to come to get a free snack too, right? And a lot of those are invasive as well. Most of the ones that we worry about, Rattus rattus, Mus musculus, are not native. Those are the domestic and invasive house rat and house mice. Coyotes, right? If you got a whole bunch of lame, relatively unintelligent, unafraid ducks running around, that's an easy meal for a coyote or a bobcat, so you might get more predators coming in. Raccoons, they will eat anything. They are opportunistic omnivores. They love anything that you throw at them, right? And so they will come in and get that food that you left out. And so now you're increasing those rodent populations, which increases the drive for predators to come into the area. Habitat degradation. So this can take a lot of different forms. You can see it here with some erosion controls. So a lot of our bigger duck and geese species, especially like Canada goose and your swans, they are kind of grazers, and they eat a whole lot of vegetation. And so, where that may have normally been kind of a vegetated coastline, they eat all that stuff down. Now it's bare dirt. Now when water comes through there, you can see all those exposed roots from all that erosion coming in there. And it also happens, that's the obvious stuff. That's the stuff we can see. It's easy to show that. The other stuff that's harder to show a picture of is most of what they eat is submersed aquatic vegetation, the native stuff that grows at the bottom of the ponds, right? And they will go down there, if they're in high enough density, they're gonna eat all that up, the mute swans and the Canada geese, they're gonna eat all that, or the Egyptian geese, they're gonna eat all that before the native ducks that come in the winter, they won't have near as much to forage on, right? And so that can lead to, that's where all the base of the food chain inside those ponds lives. So all your aquatic invertebrates, all your little fish use it for cover, and then you end up with a situation where all that stuff gets degraded out, gets eaten away, because they aren't going to stop eating, right? They're just going to keep going. And then you get this kind of degraded pond habitat that's kind of just like a pool with an earthen bottom rather than like proper vegetation. Water quality, this is another huge one. This is the slide I hit the most if I ever give this talk in New Braunfels. That photo top left is bread, right? So that is people throwing bread into the water, and then the ducks and geese not getting to it, and then it clogs up the waterways. You can actually create like these little weird like bread dams that cause all kinds of different issues. That is increasing your waste in the waterway, which gives all the bad microbes and all the algae, like you see in the photo right underneath that, nutrients to feed off of, and creates those algal blooms and increases those bacterial densities. When you get that, then you can get what is called an hypoxic environment, so the algae will choke out all the oxygen, and then you get low oxygen levels in the water, and then your fish all die off. And so that's what's in that top right photo. And then birds poop a lot, a whole heck of a lot. And we actually have measurable water quality concerns when there are large levels of native, but also non-native waterfowl in the waterways. From their excrement, which has ammonia in it, which feeds the algae. It also has things like E. coli in it, right? Which is not good for us to be around, right? If anybody's heard of a food establishment being shut down because of it, right? It's not good for us to ingest. It makes us very sick, gives us food poisoning, and so it can actually make waterways unsafe for human recreation, which is part of why they do a lot of duck and geese management, particularly on the invasives, in Land Park in New Braunfels, because they were put on a tentative impaired waterways list back in 2016, which means that they were considering making the Canal River unsafe for human recreation, which, if you know anything about New Braunfels, would be really bad for the economy, right? And so that kind of lit fire under people to go out there and start removing all those non-native ducks and geese. So management options, right? Again, I'm not going to come in there and steal your geese. I'm not going to come in there and run them off. But we do outreach and education. I come talk to groups like this and explain why feeding them is bad and why you shouldn't do it. Feeding ordinances are also a great option that we use. Feeding ordinances are simply just either citywide or countywide bans on feeding wildlife. Usually there's a little carve out for bird feeders, because those don't tend to have, and I'm talking about like the hanging bird feeders for cardinals and stuff like that, that don't have the really bad habituation issues like we have with people running up and throwing bread at ducks. But it makes it, a warning and then a fine if you're feeding wildlife. That's another tool that we use. And again, that's the local government's doing that. We just recommend it, and it's up for them if they want to take it up or not. And then signage, and then me coming out and talking to people. But what about healthy foods? I always get this question. What about I'm not a bad person. I'm not feeding them bread. I'm feeding them the good stuff, right? Like rice and lettuce and oats and worms and all these kinds of things. It's still going to lead to all of those habituation issues. It's still going to lead to all those disease management issues. It's still going to lead to water quality issues if you're feeding them artificially, and it's still going to make them think that humans are friends, and then not all humans are friends to them, and that usually ends up for bad outcomes for the wildlife. So again, if you take anything away from this talk, don't feed the wildlife. Let the wildlife feed itself. Now, what do you want to do if you want to promote them, if you still want to feed them, but you're like, oh no, now I can't feed them? what you do is you do wetland reclamation work to make your ponds really, really good habitats and environments. Do a little bit of aquatic plant planting, which can be kind of fun. Go out and make a day out of it, and you put all the plants in there, and then they grow up really nice. And then now you're providing them natural food sources to munch on. You still get the joy of watching them eat food, but you're not the one handing it to them. So management options for non-native waterfowl. There's no state regulations for non-native waterfowl. I think this guy finally done. Tech issue number 12. Oh. No, now it's back. Of course, now the second I set it down, it comes back. All right. How about there we go. That sounds a little more stable. All right. Tech issue number 13. All right. Management options for non-native waterfowl. Right. So there are no state regulations for non-native waterfowl. There's no federal regulations for non-native waterfowl, right? These are not protected birds under something that we have, which is, I've alluded to a couple times, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act of 1918, and then it was officially ratified and modified in 1922. But it is a sweeping treaty between Canada, United States and Mexico, all of the North American countries, to protect migratory birds. It provides a whole sweeping amount of federal protections for migratory birds, and so it prevents things from like removing nests and stuff like that without proper permits and without certain circumstances going in. That doesn't apply to the mute swan, that doesn't apply to the Egyptian goose, that doesn't apply to all the domestic duck hybrid things that are running around, right? Because those are not native. They're not naturally here. They're from other continents and brought over. And I didn't mention it earlier. I'm bouncing around a little bit. But with mute swan, those were mostly brought to North America for like status symbol and because people liked looking at them and people liked eating them. And then they just spread from there. So they just got more and more prolific over the years. That was brought in the late 1800s. And then they there's some evidence that they might have been in zoos in like the 1850s, but the late 1800s is when they were brought over, and the king and queen still do own them, and they will ship them around the world as like gifts to prominent politicians and business folk and stuff like that. So that's still a thing that happens to this day, and then they put it out in their pond, and then next thing you know, they have a population. Some of the things that you can do trap and removal, trap, remove, humanely euthanize, and then oiling or addling eggs, which is essentially killing the eggs and preventing the populations from growing at a rapid rate. Addling is where so the oiling is literally kind of what it sounds. You put oil on the compound and it kills them inside. Addling is where you remove them from the nest, humanely euthanize them. I don't know the exact procedures that they typically use for that. And then they put them back in the nest so the eggs aren't like destroyed from that process. And the reason why is that if a bird's nest fails from predation or it gets blown out of a tree or whatever happens, then they will typically try to make another nest. And so by addling it, you put the eggs back in there, or you put dummy eggs back in there, so they think that they're still incubating eggs, so they don't go and create another 30 eggs that you have to worry about, right? And then alternatives, right? So you're like, oh man, Joseph's just here to rain on my parade and make me feel bad about ducks and geese and tell me all the bad doom and gloom things. But no, there's a lot of wonderful things you can do. It's like, how do I get to enjoy these wonderful birds now that I know all this information about what I was doing was wrong? Bird watching, that's a huge one, right? So that's a huge thing that I do. I love watching wildlife. I love watching what they do. And the cool thing about watching them from afar with some binoculars or from a distance with your naked eye, because mute swans are really big, you don't need binoculars for them, is instead of watching them eat all these non-natural things, you get to watch them do what they do. So as much as I'm an avid bird watcher and a former ornithologist who loves building up his life list and adding new birds and species and all that kind of stuff, what I love more than anything is getting to watch an animal do what it's supposed to do. So you get to sit there and watch them and learn about the wildlife and see how they would naturally forage instead of just seeing them poke around and eating, stuff on the shore. Contribute to citizen science projects, right? So the way I was able to get that species list that I threw up at the beginning that was very rough and dirty, but was through iNaturalist, right? So this is an app you can have on your phone. You can take photos of anything. It doesn't have to be birds. eBird is a little bit more bird-centric, but by taking photos of the wildlife or reporting seeing that wildlife, you go down to your pond, you say, I saw 10 mute swans, and I saw 6 least grebes or pied-billed grebes or something like that. And by reporting that, you help us, the scientists, when we're going in there to figure out regulations, or we're going there to figure out the distribution of the wildlife. We know where they're at, and so you can help contribute to us by reporting it that way. And you still get the enjoyment out of watching them, and still getting the enjoyment out of contributing to that wildlife without harming them. Photography, that's another huge one. That's a great hobby to get into. I've never been able to consistently pick it up, other than just because my cell phone is too convenient. But yeah, getting into photography, taking really beautiful photos of them, you can get decently close, but not so close that you're disturbing them. And then improve your local park, right? So all that wetland reclamation work I talked about, that's work that you can either manually help out with, you can provide funding for, you can support organizations that do that, like the Master Naturalist or the Master Gardeners, to return those ponds and Bear Audubon, and return those ponds to a natural state. And so you get to see these more improved rather than just kind of a puddle on the ground with some grass around it. Promote healthy habitats. I've yammered on about that one for a good bit, but this is, kind of what a natural pond wetland system looks like, right? So you have your kind of weedy stuff on the edges, your taller reeds, you have some of your aquatic vegetation, your floating aquatic vegetation right in there. Underneath all that, you're going to have submersed aquatic vegetation. It's all these different layers, just like you think about a forest with all the different layers of the canopy. It's like that, but just with water, and getting all those nice native plants in there that allow it to perform like a normal habitat should. And then you get more wildlife species coming in. It's more useful for our native ones that are coming through in the winter time, and you get to go out to a much more pristine, beautiful thing and feel like you're escaping the city rather than being in the middle of it. So that's enough of me yammering on. I'll take any questions that you have at this point.
What about these bird feeders for little birds? Is that okay?
Yeah, so for whatever reason, all of these habituation concerns that we have when people are like throwing out deer corn, or they're throwing out bread, and they're throwing out all these different food sources onto the ground that anything can get at, we don't tend to see the negative effects for the smaller bird feeders. And so those are usually fine, and almost always we carve out exceptions into our feeding ordinances that we recommend for bird feeders, because they generally don't create as many problems as the other ones do. Now, the concentration and the disease concern can sometimes be the case. So like we saw over the last year with the avian influenza outbreak, and then there was another outbreak 2 years back, I think now, up in the Northeast. I don't remember which disease that specifically was, but you'll get a news blast. You'll see me up on the news going, hey, everybody take down your feeders and clean them, and don't put them up for a little bit just because we're having a disease outbreak and we don't want to spread it around to them unintentionally. But as far as all the other effects, generally in bird feeders, you're actually putting stuff in there that is more like the normal nutrition that they would get in the wild. So the birds that are coming to your feeders are your more granivorous birds that like to eat seeds, right? And so sunflower seeds are normal and native and natural in North America, and so putting them in a feeder, it's just a weird looking flower as far as the bird is concerned, right? Or like if you've ever put out hummingbird feeders and you see how aggressive those hummingbirds get around those hummingbird feeders, that's because they can fly up to 5,000 flowers in a day, and they can remember the location of all 5,000 of those flowers, and they know the relative nectar abundance that they got at those flowers. So like, that's the honey hole, that's the good one, right? I'm gonna go back to that one every, the 332nd blue flower on the right? That's the one that they're gonna go to because it has all the food in it. When they find your hummingbird feeder, they're like, this is a near endless supply of nectar. And so it is more energy efficient to defend that one feeder than it is to try to go fly around to 5,000 of them. And so yeah, that's a long-winded answer to your question, but yeah, bird feeders are typically fine. Yeah. Anything else? Yes.
Don't have very strong voice.
Here, I'll bring the microphone to you.
My wife and I, a couple of weeks ago, observed and the two of our adult swans playing around the spillway and the ponds. And the Pascalones happened to have seen the same activity. What was happening, if you picture the lakes right outside of the water's edge, the right-hand lake has a spillway that goes, when it overflows, to the fifth lake. But at any rate, there is a ramp on the left, a ramp on the right, there's concrete on the top, and the water at the bottom. We saw the adults, two swans, climb up the left side, walk across, slide down the second slide, swim back, and keep doing this. Made several rounds. Just so happens that we were sitting next to the Pascalones, and they had seen the same thing and had taken a picture of it. Has anybody else seen this action? And is this a thing that's been observed by the Fish and Wildlife people?
Yeah, so animal behavior is a very complex thing, and it is a very hard to understand thing. And it's one of those things that we're constantly learning stuff about. We're constantly, the thing that makes humans unique changes for everybody when they learn it in school, for every generation, is because the thing that we think is unique to us no longer applies, right? So back in like the 80s, 90s, it was tool use. That was the big thing everybody talked about. They're like, we're the only things that use tools. Well, chimpanzees use tools a ton, orangutans use tools a ton, even crows use tools a ton, right? And then play was one of the things that I was taught that was unique to us. But then every single one of us has a dog, so we know that's not true, right? Or seen a dog play, and we know that's not true. And we see it in the wild. We see dolphins play, right? When they're in captivity, they blow smoke, the little bubble rings, and they go and play with them, right? That's as far as we can tell, serves no purpose other than having fun. And I would love to say that that's some complex swan mating ritual behavior that means something, and it may very well mean something, but it's probably the simplest answer. Many things are in science, is that it's probably just playing. It's a fairly sedentary wildlife species here that is established year-round. It doesn't have a whole lot of predators. It's pretty big. It's got a lot of free time on its hands. And there's something about that sensation that it enjoys, and it's going to keep doing that. So again, I can't say with definitive, hard science behind that what that swan pair was doing, but it would seem on the surface that it was some sort of play or some sort of behavioral enrichment. And so I think that would be a perfectly acceptable explanation of this. But yeah, we see wildlife do a whole bunch of weird stuff, and a lot of the time it does have some sort of biological purpose to it. But there's a lot of advantages to play. You see a lot of young mammals play with each other to learn how to hunt. You see, that even that dolphin example, yeah, it might just be for fun, but that probably helps them train their flipper eye coordination, right? It helps train them for hunting fish or something like that. So there's probably some of that in every bit of play, but yeah, I think it was probably just play. Yeah.
All of a sudden, the first group of swans, just one day, all of the babies left. And is that typical? Did the mother and father say, okay, kids, it's time to get away, get the heck out of here? And can we expect that for this group? And where did they go?
All right, so I'll tackle it in sequential order. The answer to your first question is sometimes yes. So birds are laid in a nest, then they hatch, then they become what we call hatchlings, and they're dependent on the nest. Ducks, swans, geese are a little different because basically the second they hatch, they start following mom around. They don't hang out in the nest, right? But they're in that kind of what I lovingly call the dependent phase. And then once they get a little bit older, in songbirds, we call them branchlings or fledglings, where they've left the nest. I would call the ducks and the swans like juveniles, right? And so they're still kind of in what I lovingly call the idiot phase, where they're not really sure how life works, and you'll see them still begging for food, or they'll beg at food. That's my favorite thing, is when they're like screaming at a pile of sunflower seeds and not understanding that they can just eat it because they still want mom to come over and pick it up and put it in their mouth, right? So, and some of them, just like we see with humans, right? Some of them, they hit 16, 18, they run off and they go and they never come back to their hometown. And then some, you kind of have to nudge out the door, right? And that happens with birds. So they'll tolerate them up to a point. And then if they're not leaving, and this isn't true for every bird species, but it's true for a lot of them, the parents will just harass them. They'll just start, usually it's the male, will just attack them. Not to actually cause harm, but just to scare them off. And they'll keep doing it and keep pushing them until they finally learn, okay, well, maybe I should get out of here. Thankfully, humans tend to be a little bit more gentle than that. But yeah, so that is normal behavior. All of them leaving at the same time, that could be some sort of biological clock-driven thing, like they just got the urge, like it's time to disperse. So we have two forms of major movement that you see. There's migration, which we all know about, right? Seasonal things. You go up to further north during the breeding season, during the warmer seasons when it's nice and good up there, and then when it starts getting cold, you go back down south, right? Those are normal kind of migratory patterns that we have. But dispersal is another one of those things. And so the reason why is genetics, right? It's the same thing of with people, that if you have inbreeding, it leads to genetic defects. The same thing happens in wildlife. And so they have an instinct to disperse. One, there's only a limited amount of resources in an area, so if all 20 of those babies stayed put and didn't go anywhere, well, then they would eat all the food resources and they would all starve to death. And then also they don't want their genes mixing with each other too much, so they don't want to be interbreeding with their brothers and sisters. And so they will disperse off in different directions all around the same time and start establishing in different places. Now, where do they go? I'm going to dodge that question. They could go anywhere that there's a nice body of water that they can settle down in. So that could be, and I don't know a lot about swan ecology for their dispersal rates, but that could be anywhere from like the next housing complex over that has ponds to other side of San Antonio to Dallas to, they can fly pretty far distances if they want to. So one of the things I do as a biologist is for game birds, for dove, we put bands on their legs, like this one right here. Although this would be very big for a dove. We put it on their legs and then we release them. We're doing that right now this time of year. And then we see where they end up when the dove season opens up and people start hunting and harvesting them. If they find a band on the leg, they report it to us. And it's crazy. Sometimes you'll ban a bird in San Antonio and it was harvested up in Dallas. Sometimes you ban a bird in San Antonio and it was harvested like right on the edge of town, just like 2 miles away, right? It just kind of varies. So I don't know if we really know what drives some of that variability, but some of them go really far, some not very much. White-tailed deer, young male, will generally disperse about 5 miles. Yeah.
And in winter, we actually get your winter ducks.
Mm-hmm.
So how could one promote the winter ducks? I mean, we had some ringneck, we had some bubbleheads.
Oh, cool.
So they're really cute and it's really nice to see them.
So I think the thing that you can do the most is the habitat modification stuff I talked about. And so I'm speaking without direct knowledge because I have not wandered the property and seen what the ponds look like. But doing things like putting in native wetland plants that are going to be useful for those species and are going to be promoting a more natural water source for them to hang around is likely going to increase the amount of wintering ducks that you'll have stop over because there's more food resources there. I mean, when they're flying over, they're just looking for any bit of water to land in, so they'll land just about anywhere. But getting them to actually stick around and stay is dependent on food sources and habitat that they can, reeds they can go up into and hide if a predator comes by, if a hawk is flying over or something like that. Aquatic invertebrates to snack on, little minnows and fish you can stock some of those native minnows and fish in there for your grebes and stuff like that to munch on. Crawfish, kingfishers love crawfish, grebes love crawfish, so those kinds of things. Promoting their food sources and their habitat is where I would start.
So I think we already have stuff in there because we have the egrets and the
Yeah, and I'm not trying to say all your ponds are bad or anything like that, but just doing things to promote it. So, making sure the water quality is good and planting those plants, but if they're lacking, getting rid of invasives if they're there.
What about turtles?
What about turtles? Do you have any specific question?
Snapping turtles, they seem to take babies at the swans.
Yeah, so snapping turtles I wouldn't worry about too much because they're native. They're supposed to be here. Alligator snapping turtle and common snapping turtle. And so that's just kind of the normal cycle of life, as hard as it is to see a baby get snatched. With most baby birds, the survivability rate is less than 20%. It's usually 10 to 20%. That's pretty normal. It's a very large component of the food source. Everybody likes those free, easy chicken nuggets, right? They're the chicken nuggets of wildlife, right? And it's hard to see, but that snapping turtle needs a snack too. So those are native, those are fine. Where we tend to have issues, and these aren't invasive, but we tend to see them released and in really high densities, is red-eared sliders. And they can cause damaging effects to your water quality. Having some is fine, because they are a native species. But a lot of people get them as pets and then realize that they live 20, 30, 40 years and don't want to deal with that. And they go and release them in ponds, and then you get these really large populations of red-eared slider. And so you can do some mitigation work on that to take some of those out. Unless you have like a crazy overpopulation of snapping turtles, I wouldn't be too concerned about it. Oh, that's interesting to know.